Hello! In this video I'll be reviewing the third issue of The Audient Void, a journal of weird fiction and dark fantasy made by Mr. Obadiah Baird. Unfortunately, I haven't been doing video reviews lately. I was thinking of reviewing some books I read before, some really good ones, but I realized that as it's been several years since I read them, I need to read them once again before I can do a proper review, and sadly I haven't had enough time for that, but I'm planning to get to it. Anyway, here I have this third issue of The Audient Void. And this issue is really special for me because one of the poems inside was written by me. Before I start reviewing this zine, I'd like to give thanks to Mr. Baird for accepting my poem, for considering it good enough to be a part of this zine. It's a really great honor for me, so thank you, Mr. Baird. So, let's start with the review. The cover design of this issue follows the tradition of the first two ones, which I have right here. I hope you can see them. So, the layouts are the same, the fonts are the same, but the cover image is a new one. The cover image shows some demon in the woods. It looks really threatening and really cool. It's really good work. So, on the first page of this zine, we have this nice picture of the forest. It's really beautiful with a lot of tiny details, as you can see. I especially like this beautiful owl right here. The whole picture looks somewhat dark, but it also looks calming in a way. I really like it. So, at the beginning we have Mr. Baird's introduction called From the Void. And I must say, I liked this introduction as soon as I started reading it. It starts with a very poetic and very intriguing first paragraph right here. And also, later on, it introduces us to the short story in this zine, and Mr. Baird described them very impactfully. His description got me quite excited about starting to read those stories. And we also get to know a bit about the poets whose work is included in the zine, and Mr. Baird wrote some really nice things about my own work, so I thank you for that once again. And there is a brief introduction to the column called You Old Lemurian by Mr. Barker, which is this one right here. And at the end of Mr. Baird's introduction, there is a nice expression of gratitude to everyone who supported The Audient Void, and it's really nice. So, speaking of You Old Lemurian by Mr. David Barker, he provides really nice insight on his writing here. He talks about his manuscripts, about some of his unpublished and unfinished work, and I, as a writer, found some of the situations he described, some of his thoughts very relatable. I found it a really delightful read. And later on, he speaks about H.P. Lovecraft's work, about his sonnet sequence called Fungi from Yugoth. And what I find especially interesting about Mr. Barker's columns is that there is something about the way he writes that just gets you intrigued about what he has to say, no matter whether you are familiar with the topic or not. I've had the honor of reading a little bit of Mr. Barker's work so far, and he's a really great writer. So, now I'm moving to the first poem in this zine. It's a poem called Haunted Planet, written by Wade German. It's a very interesting poem, quite unique among the poetry I've read in the Audient Void so far. As the title suggests, it incorporates some elements of science fiction into the atmosphere of dark fantasy. It's very original and creative. And next we have a poem by K.A. Opperman called Funeral. I've been talking quite a bit about Mr. Opperman's poetry in my previous videos. His poetry is great, and this poem is not an exception. What I found especially intriguing about this poem is some quite unusual usage of color adjectives, which give a touch of mysteriousness to the sad atmosphere of the poem. It's very good. Then we have the first short story in the zine called The Many Roads to Weatherly, written by Daniel Peterson. It comes with this illustration, which is very well done and very symbolical. If you take a look at it before reading the story, it might make you assume what's going to happen in the story. And as you read on, at some point you find out whether you were right or wrong, whether your interpretation of the picture was correct or not. And I like this story a lot, especially the way Mr. Peterson combines some bright and dark imagery into a gloomy but very unique atmosphere. The story contains a lot of descriptions written in a very rich vocabulary, and it's really good. So next there is a poem called Cat's Paw, written by Adam Bolivar. Something very unique about Mr. Bolivar's poetry is all of his poems that I read in the Audient Void so far, they are interconnected into some kind of a story. So this poem works as a sequel to his poem called The Jack of Cats, which was in the Audient Void too. And this poem provides one more part of this story, which still seems to be unfinished. It's quite unusual and very interesting, and I hope you're going to be able to read more of it in the next issue of the Audient Void. Then we have a poem called Shade Beetle, written by Scott Couturier. I hope I pronounced his last name correctly. So this poem is a Halloween themed one, and it's a very good poem. It contains very atmospheric descriptions and very interesting interpretation of the concept of the undead. It would be a really good read during some Halloween event. I really like it.